Thanks for turning out for Green Dreams, Beyond Recreation, Climate, Social Justice, and the Urban Parks Landscape Ahead. I want to call out US Bank, our series sponsor. Been wonderful to work with Karen Corbin on our board and US Bank. So thanks to them for helping bring this series to you. If you don't know the Parks Foundation, our motto is we help people help parks. We do it in a lot of ways, among them bringing inspiring experts like those in our ongoing Green Dreams series. But we also help in other ways, including grants. And we have some deadlines for those grants coming up for small grants to organizations that are doing work in parks. We also have a Parks Champion Award, awards that we give out, 2 of them each year. And those applications are open right now. So if you know a really great volunteer that you would like to nominate for that, please go to our website. And lastly, we have the first ever Joey Pope Award for Parks Leadership, which will be a $10,000 grant along with technical assistance to an emerging leader working in to better our park system. So please go to our website and find out more information at portlandpf.org. This is the 3rd conversation inspired by the 200th anniversary of Frederick Law Olmsted's birth and part of a nationwide examination of his legacy and consequences. The umbrella for it is olmsted200.org if you want to look at some of the really great programs that have been done around the country. Our first event, Greening Democracy, Sarah Zodi, a designer and professor at Harvard School of Design, took us on a tour of Olmsted's travels as a journalist documenting the Cotton Kingdom and how it shaped his thinking that led to his pioneering of a new American tradition of park and open space planning and design. But Sarah also showed us how she as a designer is renewing that social contract in more inclusive ways. In our second event, PSU historians Catherine McNure and Carl Abbott showed us some of the myths and the mixed outcomes of the Olmsted tradition as it operated in New York and later in Portland. And tonight we want to look ahead to how we might better deal with some of the sobering futures we face and the unfinished business of our past. During Portland's record-breaking heat wave last summer, Vivek Shandas didn't head to the river, he went for the asphalt. Among other places, the corner of Southeast Woodstock Boulevard and 92nd Avenue, where he recorded a surface temperature of 180 degrees. As Sophie Peel, a reporter for Willamette Week, put it, that's hot enough to slow cook a pot roast. Last summer was a wake-up call, I think, to any Portlander who thought that our interaction with climate change was purely existential, maybe measured only in the slowly melting glaciers of Mount Hood. But it got real suddenly, very real for some people who died in what was the largest natural disaster. Most people have died in a natural disaster in Portland history. The summer before, Portland became a hotspot of a different order as protests for racial justice also got very real. Historically, the widest major city in the country has operated largely unchecked by the concerns of communities of color and the financially challenged. Tonight, we're going to focus on both the interrelationship between those heat waves, both of which have been building for many years, but we also want to imagine how we can creatively address both of these issues in our parks and open spaces. Vivek Shandas is professor at the Nohad Toulan School of Urban Studies and founder of the Sustaining Urban Places Research Lab at PSU. He's the chair of Portland's Urban Forestry Commission as well. CNE Corbin who goes by Corbin, is assistant professor of urban political ecology. Both of these people are visionaries in their own ways. Vivek is as comfortable pioneering bold new ways to use LiDAR and measuring tree canopy as he is taking the temperatures of asphalt. His research on urban tree canopies and heat island effect has been featured in publications across the country, both academic and mainstream, and are increasingly used by cities across the world. Corbin studies the relationships between the uneven distribution of environmental harms and the uneven development of environmental goods. She incorporates media studies and visual culture, often deploying speculative fiction and Afrofuturism to understand how images represent and influence environmental and racial understandings of urban spaces. As a city, Portland has a lot to figure out. And one place to do that is in public space. The parks, the streets, the sidewalks, the space that's in between all the buildings. How can we better use that to benefit all? That's what our evening is about tonight. I think it's going to be both informational and fun, because both of these people are just wonderfully imaginative and really spark up off of each other. So please welcome Corbin and Vivek.
Great, thanks, Randy. Wonderful to be here. And I think we're going to go back and forth today. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're hoping to have a provocative conversation. We'll get into some intentions in a second, but just really like to start off by introducing myself in my own words, and then turn it over to Corbin to introduce herself, and we can just kind of kick it off from there. So my background, I consider myself coming from a great deal of privilege. I am an able-bodied cisgender immigrant from South Asia who's had the privilege of going to get a graduate degree. And I've been able to take that degree and try to apply it to various questions that are coming up all around us in terms of environment, climate, and the built and our cities. And so that really lends itself to a very particular perspective, which I'm grateful to share with you all today. And really want to lift up the Parks Foundation for being able to take on such a challenging topic. It's not something we claim, or at least I can say I claim to have any answers for, though we are in a place where this conversation in the city of Portland feels very real, as Randy was putting it. And it's something that I think we're really grateful to be coming to you to discuss today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Corbin, who can then maybe, even after you introduce yourself, start with a little screen share.
Sounds good. So a little bit about myself. I'm a recent transplant to Portland from Oakland, California. And before that, I was in Washington, D.C. And I did not necessarily come from a place of privilege, but being able to be connected to Rock Creek Park, which I considered one of the biggest backyards for me to be rough and tumble, and really gave me a perspective about looking at the connection between the built-in environment and the natural environment. And unfortunately, I wanted to study green cities and rooftop gardens and, this future understanding of what could be. But unfortunately, there was so much inequity that I had to figure that out first, with the hope that we can get from where we are to a more environmentally and socially just future. So I will leave it there for now. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I hope this works out. All right. Can you see that okay?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you,
Wonderful.
Corbin.
All right. And our title, Beyond Recreation, Climate, Social Justice, and the Urban Landscape Ahead. So we are doing something a little bit different. I think a lot of people have been talking about the past, and we're hoping to maybe find some pathways towards a different future. So if you want to start with intentions, Vivek, you want to?
Yeah, sure. So the idea here is not to come in. We spend a lot of time in classrooms and kind of working in the professoriate, talking about the theories, talking about what we've seen as important and what we see as emerging. And this intention today, I mean, we're past the 6 o'clock hour on the West Coast here, and it's time to just chat about ideas. We want to play with ideas. We want to explore what it's like to actually think about something bigger than necessarily the thing that's going to happen tomorrow or the thing that's going to happen next year. To really think about contemplating futures in terms of a way to situate ourselves to a attempted North Star here with recreation, and specifically thinking about the physicality of parks and the way that they're designed. I'll spend a little time getting into our current situation. And then we want to also talk about ideas of repair, reconciliation, and reciprocity, an alliteration that I think really is at the core of where we are today, with so many challenges facing not only public budgets for parks maintenance and caring of green spaces. We're also trying to repair communities that have been historically and deeply impacted, affected, hurt, and in many cases killed as a result of participating in recreational activities. And so there's a lot of reconciliation that we're really attempting to put forward here. And of course, the idea of what can we really think about a mutually reciprocal relationship with the earth we steward and our health and well-being, and how can those really come together for us to have a meaningful conversation where we're getting into the future of preservation, conservation, and creation, recreation. Corbin, anything more about intentions?
Yeah, I think what's important to keep in mind is that we have within this particular nation, I'll keep it within the US, we have a lot of questionable actions that have taken place around parks, especially around atrocities with indigenous communities and being removed from their homes. We also have, there's been stories, especially around Olmsted and the removal of African-American and Irish community members for the creation of Central Park. So one of the things that we have to really start like wrestling with is, even though we may not have been responsible for these past injustices, I think all of us can actually be responsible for what can be a an environmental and socially just future. So this is, again, playing with ideas, contemplating future possibilities, not recreating the past, right? And then thinking through what's possible when we think about preservation, conservation, and recreation, and the recreation of recreation. And one thing that I wanted to also add is also leisure. You know, it's not just about, you know, hiking and jogging and being active, but it's also a place to relax and get some respite, especially in a bustling urban setting. So you want to move to the next slide?
Yeah, let's get into this. And again, feel free to put questions in the chat. It looks like folks are introducing themselves, so that's great. So when Corbin and I were chatting about like what would be helpful in our current state and where could we go with it, one of the things that I feel like we want to start early on is this kind of drawing. I wanted to at least start with an arc of where we were with green spaces and defining our terms, green spaces in a city. So street trees, green roofs, green walls. We'll get into a lot of this, parks, including the big ones like Forest Park in the Portland metro region, or even very small parks that are in neighborhood settings. These green spaces have really got a lot of notice because of this term that emerged in the late 90s. And this, we're not going back 100 years necessarily, but just even taking back 20 to 30 years, this term ecosystem services was brought up as a means by which we need, we can measure the services that these green spaces are providing to humans. And so it was an attempt to really bring into the public policy debate the fact that we haven't been accounting for the bees that have been pollinating our fruit trees and the fruit that we receive and the health that we received as a result of all those services. And so that really started a whole kind of canon of literature that described different ways in which economists and ecologists were largely working in on this idea of ecosystem services. And if you go to the next slide, it really got applied to this idea that human systems and, quote, the natural systems would be able to work together to improve our health, our longevity, our sustainability, and our resilience. And this idea has been really kind of captured in this image that a colleague of mine, Aaron Ramirez at Reed College, assembled to be able to show the dynamics playing out at the regional to local level, and part of a grant that we have through the National Science Foundation to really identify the relationship between urban forests, human health, and what kind of policy and decision-making systems are creating inequities in that process of improving health, those communities that may have access to improved health through our ecosystem services. This is, if you go to the next slide, this kind of plays out in various ways of depicting individual trees to large parks, to eco roofs, and the processes or functions that our green spaces provide, whether it's playing, whether it's cultural, whether it's historic and spiritual, or whether it's very material. These caricatures of an individual tree or a forest have been through the 90s really giving us a understanding of how are we benefiting, and the kind of narrative is still largely around kind of how do we benefit from the trees, and what are the trees giving us. I remember reading as a child reading my child The Giving Tree, a classic book that was, you know, all about how ecosystem services fundamentally. And so it's really embedded in many of our cultural icons of trees, and many people love the trees because they are providing ways in which we can benefit. Though there's a bunch of other questions that are emerging. And if we go to the next slide, one of the things that really comes up is, where are the trees? And if we look at the city of Portland's maps, in terms of where the green spaces are, you see large green spaces west of the Willamette on the left side of the screen, and you see much more kind of a tattered tapestry, if you will, of green spaces on the east side of the city. And that really lends itself to questions of, you know, how did these trees end up where they are? And so the last a decade or so of literature has really started asking the question, well, if you have all these ecosystem services, then what has nature done for historically marginalized communities lately? And so that's where we started getting a lot more into questions of environmental, social, and climate justice in terms of who's benefiting really, and how are they benefiting? And so a number of maps have emerged like this that are showing different ways in which particular communities, particularly those that are low income and communities of color, often are in places where there are the least amount of green space. And so that has become, in the last 10 years, much more common kind of narrative to hear in the research realms, as well as in the practice of doing urban forest, urban park management, is where are the parks distributed, who's benefiting, who isn't. And so that gets us into a little bit more of a local question, which this is a pattern we've seen across the country, in fact. So if you go to the next slide, here in Portland, I've shown this recent study that we've done, which is still undergoing publication. Though when we look at changes in tree canopy in the last about 8 years, what we see is that not only was there lower canopy to begin with in the east side of town, for example, we're seeing greater losses in the east side of town. So now a dynamic question around, not only do we have less canopy, though these places that are dark purple are losing the most canopy over this last 8 years. And that gets us asking questions of, well, if there are ecosystem services, who's benefiting and who's starting to lose the benefits from the trees? And the next slide just kind of takes this and summarizes it by neighborhood. So you see Hazelwood, where the largest number of people died from the heat dome event last year, had the greatest loss in tree canopy, whereas neighborhoods like Pleasant Valley or Northwest Heights had the greatest increase in tree canopy over this period of time from 2014 to 2020. And so this brings us into some deeper questions, which, if you go to the next slide, we can start asking about the social and environmental justice aspects of this work. And I'll turn it over to Corbin to kind of start framing this out a bit more.
Great. And I think it's really good to start with definitions. And so let's start with the EPA's definition as environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And fair treatment means no group of people should bear a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, governmental, and commercial operations. Often when we talk about environmental justice, we're actually talking about environmental injustices. And there's two sides of it, right? The uneven distribution of environmental harms and the uneven development of environmental goods in which low-income residents and communities of color are disproportionately exposed to environmental hazards while also being prevented from benefiting from environmental amenities. And so this starts begging the question, is when we think about environmental justice, and then really quickly going back to this idea of fair treatment, that no group should bear a disproportionate share of negative environmental consequences, but doesn't tend to talk about as thinking about EJ as nobody has to bear the disproportionate burden or even the burden of environmental disamenities or environmental harms. How do we remove that from anybody versus everybody bearing their burden? And so Vivek, if you want to explain this map really quickly.
Sure. And so if you have in your mind kind of the city of Portland and kind of distribution of Canopy that we were getting at earlier, and then the loss happening in East Portland, interestingly, when you just overlay some sociodemographic information taken from the US Census over the same, over nearly the same period of time from 2010 to 2020, we see that the areas that have been losing the greatest amount of tree canopy are also the areas where we're seeing the a phenomenon that I would even go so far as calling it white flight in a sense. We're seeing communities of color moving from, in many cases, the process of gentrification, moving from North and Northeast Portland, some areas of Southeast as well, to Far East Portland. And this is a process well documented by several colleagues that I work with, as well as other studies that have come out of processes that have been playing out since the early 2000s, maybe even earlier, in terms of dispossession of land, in terms of gentrification, in terms of erasure of communities that have been living in place for generations. And now we're seeing this transition happening in terms of sociodemographics moving from areas of Portland to other areas of Portland. And the darker red here symbolizes an proportional increase in communities of color in specific areas of the city. And so when you kind of put together, at least empirically in my mind, the relationship between where trees are, where they're being lost the fastest, and then questions of demographic dynamics that are playing out due to a variety of different forces at work, we're seeing a pattern emerge that really begs to ask the question of what are the social and environmental justice questions that are right here in our backyard.
Thank you. And I think it's important to just, back it up with some numbers. Neighborhoods of color, 24% less access to park space. And we also see this, looking at residents low-income neighborhoods have 26 less park space per person, right? So it's not just about tree canopy, but it's also about green spaces, lawns, gardens, and these other forms that cool the city down, as well as provide opportunities for congregation and recreation. Those who are able to stay put are even finding like what I like to call like in situ gentrification, green space gentrification, in which unfortunately, I believe this was in 2020, with the pandemic, everything has collapsed on itself. But just thinking about the birder, Christian Cooper, just asking Amy Cooper to please go ahead and keep your dog on the leash, and how that came out to being a possible situation with law enforcement, which she called law enforcement on. And so this is an incident where luckily enough, nobody was harmed physically from this altercation, but folks of color who are able to stay put. And I'm thinking about not just the ones that are being moved out, that are probably being moved out to more precarious environmental situations when they are forced out of the city, but the ones that are able to stay put are also experiencing less access because of these situations. And just so everybody knows that I'm not being hyperbolic, this is Alex Nieto and Tamara Rice. Both of them were murdered in their neighborhood parks in 2014. Alex Nieto in San Francisco in, I believe it was March of 2014, and then Tamir Rice in November of 2014. Both of them were considered to be out of place, and there was questions about whether or not they were dangerous. And law enforcement met them with a bullet before any questions, right? And so it's really important that environmental justice is not just about access to natural spaces, but be able to be actually welcomed and enjoy those spaces. So transitioning a little bit to climate change. So kick this over to you, Vivek.
Yeah. Work that we're doing right now is trying to also characterize the impacts that warming temperatures have on our green spaces, and some work with colleagues at Washington State University and Reed College. We're trying to ask the question of how can we better detect vulnerabilities in our urban forest using some remotely sensed data. And these trees were in good or fair situation just a few years ago. And so in Lents Park, these well-established mature trees, one of my favorite pictures taken by a colleague, showed that just a few years ago, we had full, robust, healthy canopies on these trees. And then within 4-year period, we're starting to see major scorch, dieback, and mortality of these well-established, sometimes maybe 50 years or older trees, cedars in Lents Park. And so the question, and this is in a park, not to think about trees that are, for example, in a highly urbanized environment, the exposure that some of these trees have to rising temperatures and their evolutionary capacity to really be able to take on these temperatures that are breaking not only climate models, but records as well. And so this is work that was really highlighted, if you go to the next slide, in last year during the Heat Dome event, where if you notice in this map, one of the interesting things is we were at the southern end of this monster heat wave that came through. And while this was just kind of in some ways a miss, places like Linton and British Columbia, over 1,000 people died during this. And recent evidence is showing that the tree canopy in much of the Northwest was heavily damaged and impacted by this. And many of the impacts we're not going to see for years to come, because these are kind of hits that a well-established tree takes. And over time, if it's not able to really photosynthesize and kind of draw on that solar radiation, it could really mean sustained long-term fatality of many of the trees in our well-established trees, not to mention many of the deaths occurring to the smaller, younger saplings that are recently planted. If you go to the next slide, some images that a staffer in my lab, Cassie Bent, created to look at the distribution of the deaths that occurred from the heat wave. And we've been measuring temperatures for over a decade in the city, and we're starting to kind of highlight places that are hotter, places where deaths occurred, and the kind of climate and ecological impacts that we're starting to already very quickly observe empirically. And so this really, these two maps, one of just the distribution of heat, temperatures ranging about 17 degrees Fahrenheit from one part of the city to another. Again, noticing the west side of the city much cooler generally than the east side. Abundance of tree canopy playing a significant role. And then the map on the right, Portland fatalities during the heat wave, and the darker colors represent places where more people died. And really, again, falling right into a set of patterns that we're picking up on throughout the region. And these are, again, empirical data, so they really are starting to tell a story that many of us have been talking about for a long time, but now that we've collected a tremendous amount of data and able to show this very, I think, compellingly, the fireside chat that we're hoping to have we're hoping to provoke kind of how these challenges that we're kind of framing this conversation around can be potentially addressed by thinking about what the city could become. Corbin?
Wonderful. So we're going to transition a little bit. This is where I start getting excited about integrated ecology and the promise of the green city. So we did touch on ecosystem services, and I think this is what's really important around the promise and the possibilities of the green city, right? So green spaces, trees, gardens, absorb CO2 and air pollutants, reduces flooding and stormwater runoff, and mitigates urban heat island effect. What parks do, or green spaces also do, is create spaces for recreation, and I would say also leisure, food production, community gardens, wildlife habitat formation. So, there is nature within the urban, possibilities for novel ecosystem creation, and social cultural production and placemaking, right? So places that people can go and enjoy community events as well. So these are also connections to nature. And what also doesn't tend to get talked about, or even, well, I would say it gets talked about, but it's not uplifted, is that urban areas actually has biodiversity. And this is a really good definition of it. Biodiversity is the variability within amongst species. So how many different species are there at all these different organizational levels? And our urban natures are teeming with life. And unfortunately, what tends to happen as we end up in this hierarchy of natural systems and park systems. And I'm going to ask, when we move forward from this talk, is to break the nature hierarchy, that the pre-Columbian Yosemite Park that is supposed to be untouched by man is supposed to be like the zenith. This is the pinnacle of what a natural space is supposed to be. But again, going back to the intentions of this talk, is that we have to also understand that it was actually managed by indigenous communities, right? So when we look at the national park system as the nature, we also see this hierarchy, or in which low income neighborhood parks are not thought of as that. And you can see this in this image right here. They're not as biodiverse. It's hardly any trees. It doesn't have the same ecosystem services. So this would not help flooding, or won't help with urban island effect. So we need to break this hierarchy and not think of the national park as the only nature, but thinking about the new possibilities that are out there, right? So we have things like bioswells, and this is a pretty wide one. And as you can see, it is bringing the rainwater that overflows into this sort of ditch area that prevents like trash and other sort of urban debris that ends up in the streets to end up in not only in our different parts clogging up our sewer system, but also causes flooding within cities. Vivek, did you want to touch on anything with bioswales or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, Portland's one of the OG bioswale cities, right? It was like EPA came in, lawsuit in 95. It's like big pipe and bioswale hybrid approach. So, in many ways, you could say that the kind of the ethic, or even the kind of management orientation in this case, Bureau of Environmental Services in the city, were really open very early on to exploring different ways to green a city. And so that piece, led by several community-based organizations and those who've been here for decades, have really been kind of pushing and encouraging different forms of greening. So in many ways, I mean, when I landed in Portland, it was such a refreshing moment to actually walk into City Hall, as well as the bureaus, and just engage in these conversations about what additional forms of microgreening can we explore? How are these bioswales working for the communities that live around them? Where are they going? And so a lot of projects have really been already started, because we have this long history of incorporating bioswales and developments, and in many ways right into code. So I think in many ways, Portland, I would just reflect, is well ahead of many cities in terms of this particular feature on the landscape.
Yeah, one thing that I want to trouble notions around bioswales, right? they're not perfect, but they are incorporating ecology and nature, right? And what I want us to move away from is this sort of museum quality of these spaces. And why I say that is this isn't as much of as a green space and an ecosystem fix or opportunity this is, it's not necessarily a space of congregation. So this is not an actual park for people to recreate and congregate in. And it becomes more, like I said, a museum space where I'm not against biophilia. I think it's good. I think it's healthy. And at the same time, if we're putting our money into bioswales, what are the other opportunities that we can think through, right? And I'm always, because green spaces are so versatile, there's so many opportunities if we get more creative with it, right? So bioswales, very important. And I'm going to move over to the next one. And this is something a lot more classic, right? The promenade. Don't see these a lot or as much as they used to be, but I think these are wonderful spaces for congregation, for people to just sit and watch each other. I love the trees. I'm not usually very happy about trees in a line, but I like these mature trees. It provides shading. I will also push this. Could you imagine if this was an urban orchard and where you can actually pick the fruit, that these trees were like serving a food need as well. So there's all these possibilities. Again, how do you play with these ideas? All right. I mean, I can also see this is a great catwalk. If you want to have a fashion show, why don't we have fashion shows in parks? These are the places where we can have them, right? One thing that I really love around the green city is this understanding of daylighting. So almost ripping off the pavement of a freeway system, as you can see here in Korea, and opening up this natural stream and adding green space, and it looks completely different. And it's created a green space where there wasn't one. This is literally a freeway. So there's some really inventive ways. These are probably larger projects, but what does it mean to size it for Portland or size it for other areas? So how do we think through these spaces? How can these spaces be used? Did you want to add anything to this, Vivek?
No, no, I think that's really it. This picture is literally 1,000 words, especially when you know that there was a massive road complex. I think about Tom McCall Park, and I think about the waterfront that, again, visionary folks in Portland were able to think about green spaces replacing massive amounts of asphalt and concrete. And it's really kind of harkens to a time where we could explore those options.
Right. And it's like these big projects, a lot of times people are scared of them, but the results can be really beautiful and welcoming. I'm actually in love with this. So this is San Antonio, Texas. And so this is a wildlife bridge. So, fauna can get across and don't have to compete with the cars. I think it's absolutely beautiful. And what would this mean to size it down for the city, right? What would it mean to find these sort of walkable or maybe bikeable paths that are immersed in green space, and like kind of brings another way of thinking through what a linear park could be through this, right? So these are just ideas. Again, these are large scale ideas, but how do we make them Portland or for local cities? Also, living walls. I love a living wall. And could you imagine, again, imagining and thinking through this, could you imagine the city blooming during the spring with all these different flowers showing up? I mean, these could also be locations where you can put like food, whether that's spinach or berries or anything like that. Like, how do we reclaim a lot of this pavement? And pavement is not just what we walk on, but these sort of like sterile business fronts that can also help with climate mitigation, including cooling buildings down, helping with flood mitigation, urban heat island effect. There's so many opportunities here, and they're just beautiful. I mean, it's almost like a mural made out of vegetation.
I'll just maybe quickly add, Corbin, that just in the previous one, this infrastructure bill that Biden that's approved has a bunch of money set aside for wildlife corridors. So it's super interesting that these are, while they're ideas, they're also finding their way into various circles and really starting to get some receptivity. And so we have these opportunities to kind of think about, even with a living wall, off the shelf technologies that are able to improve the climate resiliency. We measured temperatures of walls. I just happened to be in Southeast Portland during the heat dome event and measured a temperature of a wall that was identical, and it was essentially one side had a green wall and the other didn't, and it was remarkable to see temperature differences of upwards of 80 degrees Fahrenheit just on that surface itself. So there's a lot of potential here that's very practical. That's also, of course, beautiful if it's done well and taken care of well.
Absolutely. Right. And so Singapore has been doing some really wonderful building green space configurations. So this is not necessarily a living wall, but a sort of terrace looking opportunity. And I also have to go back to this. A lot of this requires money, right? And so this is the Royal Park Hotel. How do we do this on a budget so everybody can experience it, and not for it to only be available for those that can afford it? How do we think through that, right? And so one of the ideas that I've been playing with is this understanding of holistic decentralization, a non-contiguous urban ecosystem made up of gardens, parks, living walls, and various other green spaces, urban natures. These green spaces exist on multiple scales and levels, vertical from the ground to the rooftops to skyscrapers, and across scales from the individual pocket park to the patchwork of green spaces within the built environment to their connections to regional and national park systems. When we only think about these small parks as somehow separate, or even as these sort of green oases, and not seeing them as connected to the larger ecosystem, because birds and bees and other fauna are not considering, oh, I'm in a national park system, so I'm in real nature. Oh, I'm in an urban park. It doesn't have the biodiversity that I want. They're not necessarily having those connections, but how do we think about leveraging each opportunity for these green spaces to really provide not only ecosystem services for humans, but for non-human communities is super important, right? So how do we think through the ecology of cities and get away from this idea that we have to escape from the city? We have to escape from the urban. What happens if we don't want to escape from the urban and it becomes a park? How do we think through it then, right? So we'll probably start thinking about what type of natures do we want to be in, right? Do we want to be in the urban nature? Do you want to be in suburban? Do we want to be in the more wilderness types, right? But holistic decentralization gives us an opportunity of really thinking about, again, incorporating and ingraining these green spaces in all these different ways. And I honestly would love to see a city bloom with all their living walls, maybe just on the south walls, maybe southwest walls. We might have to talk about that. So moving to 21st century parks and the possibility of urban greening. So in the last 2 decades, since about the early 2000s, we started seeing a proliferation of parks, probably not since Olmsted. And one of these parks, Chicago Millennium Park, is technically a green roof, and that's only because there's a garage underneath it, but they tout it as the largest green roof in the United States. Again, it's a space of congregation. It was a railroad park that was turned into a park. So really getting rid of that old industrial area and providing green space in a new way. Anything you want to add, Vivek? Because I'm going to talk about a few parks.
Yeah, it's interesting when we're kind of thinking about the Olmstedian transition to kind of the future, and you might pick up on Corbin and my general disinterest in kind of that lawn culture that we've proliferated in parks. And granted, I mean, I grew up being able to run around a local park and kick a soccer ball and really, play with friends and wonderful things. If I had a sense of kind of the wildness of parks near me, I think I would have also experienced a whole different set of ways to interact with urban nature. And so ideas of kind of the lawn culture and thinking about what wildness might look like in an urban setting are themes that I think we're really holding on to. And when we see these well-manicured landscapes, I think there's a lot of, legal and budgetary questions that come up. And at the same time, what are options for us to really start thinking a little bit outside of this highly manicured tradition that urban park design and landscape architecture have been kind of indoctrinated into? And not to call any profession out in that sense, nevertheless, it is remarkable when we look across parks how much similarity there is in terms of the lawns and the wide open kind of places that are very fertilizer hungry and very kind of machine hungry for keeping them maintained. And so there are a number of things that also we're trading off as a result of creating these landscapes.
Right, and parks like Chicago's Millennium Park are destination parks, right? They're really for tourists with the idea that local residents can also use it, right? So these are the parks that end up on like city pamphlets, right, to usher people into them. But when we are considering 21st century park uses, what I'm hoping that we do is get away from what we have always done and start thinking differently. And I think the ecosystem and climate change conversation that transpired earlier is it's super important to realize that we are not going to be able to get back to a pre-Columbian time and like stick a land in and stay there. I think we're definitely moving towards adaptation. And what does adaptation and fluidity mean as we start approaching not just climate change? And I think when we talk about climate change, I think it's super important to underline the severe weather events, right? The heat dome, the flooding, things that kind of jolt us into acting different and thinking through how parks can serve us in that particular way, right? Right, the New York High Line, again, adding green space, also causing gentrification, right? These are the things that we're going to have to wrestle with. How do you green and not displace? And how do we not make greening a situation where you have to make your choices on whether or not you're going to have a longer life expectancy or not? And unfortunately, that's what we are doing with our low income and communities of color that are in these sort of environmentally precarious locations. But Linear Park, New York High Line, it's definitely wrestling Central Park for #1 most visited park within the nation and definitely within New York. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So this is not just happening up north, right? This is also happening in the south. This is Birmingham Railroad Park in Birmingham, Alabama. Super important is a lot of these parks are also private and public money funded. And so there are these situations in which those partners can shut down my park for an event, which actually prevents access to that park space. So there's these really interesting funding schemes that are happening within cities that are actually making access to green spaces available, but also precarious depending on management practices. This is Oakland's Lake Merritt. I like to call it my second hometown, so to speak. And this is 4 acres of green space that just didn't exist prior to 2011. 4 brand new acres of green space. It's an amphitheater. It's right on the water. And as you can see, folks come from all over just to hang out. All right. Remembering that parks are also for recreation, leisure, and congregation. Cully Park in Portland. You want to take this one on?
Sure. Like landfill, community based, and really something that was a extensive process with involving community members to be able to develop this park, to be able to create wayfinding programs that allow communities in surrounding neighborhoods to access this park. And as Corbin was noting earlier, it's an area of Portland that has been historically lower income, and kind of coming back to this theme of thinking about play structures and thinking about open lawns and thinking about where and how these designs in specific neighborhoods follow certain patterns, I can't help but notice that this is very akin or very similar to what Corbin was noting earlier in terms of a highly lawned, very few trees, play structure park. And again, it's not a means for necessarily critiquing the design here. It's a recognition of a pattern of what kinds of parks are showing up in some parts of a city, whereas we're seeing other kinds of parks show up in other parts of the city. And so really thinking about why and why this is happening and what kind of systems, structures are enabling these kind of patterns of park design to show up in specific places in certain ways.
Right. And I think it's also important to remember that parks are not neutral, they're political spaces. And when you have a neighborhood that's been deprived of a green space, they want something nice like what they've seen in other places. Sometimes that they may not actually fit their function. And a lot of folks don't think about that. So I was talking to a community member once, and it's like, these amenities, these features, if you want, or characteristics of a park, they matter to communities, right? And so do you want a bocce ball court or a basketball court? You're going to pull in different people into that space, right? And whether or not a park feels welcoming determines whether people are going to use it or not. And so we have to think about not just the green spaces, but again, reciprocity, right? Reconciliation, right? We have to think about what are the past traumas of these spaces that have to be cleared up or reconciled, right? Or are we thinking through a sort of restorative environmental justice situation where we have to do some heavy lifting as the city, recognizing the racial and class issues of the past and probably currently as well, and move forward in a different way. And sometimes it's hard to articulate this to community members, but the question becomes, what do the community members really need and how do they want to use it, and how do we make it beautiful for them, right? So how do we operate out of abundance versus scarcity? What can we bring and show our love in these parks? And really moving forward, there's different types of parks. So I visited Beacon Park in Seattle probably in 2013 when they just got started. But the idea of being able to forage in the park, and I love this New York article that I got a few years ago. It's like, Beacon Park is saying, come and eat in our park. And New York Central Park is like, stop eating our park, stop foraging in it, right? So how do we use these different green spaces to not only mitigate climate issues, but mitigate hunger or provide a type of food sovereignty within urban areas? These are all the different ways that we can think about these green spaces. It still provides the shading. It provides the area for recreation. It provides a lot of opportunities, but it's just a different type of park, right? And again, some of these parks are a little bit harder to organize because people worried about getting sued, right? And so how do we think through these parks differently? I would love to think about Beacon Park, all that food waste gets put back in through composting, and makes me question, why aren't we doing more composting in our parks? Why don't we have these closed loop systems that feed nutrients back to our parks? And again, going back to leisure. So this is Street Harbor Park in Philadelphia. Of course, you have to rent these hammocks, but these are places where you're actually pulling people into congregating and for leisure, and it's at night. A lot of us don't use our parks at night. A lot of us are not allowed to use our parks at night, but there's a lot of great events that could be happening at night, and we're just not using those spaces for it. And this brings me to, again, going back to climate change and severe weather events. This is Philadelphia last year. And in some ways, as distraught as people were with the flooding, they actually looked at this image and said, wow, wouldn't it have been nice if it was actually a canal? And this almost looks like a European city in some ways because of it. Again, what does it mean to work with nature versus against it, or trying to control it in a particular way? I think we're out of those possibilities of controlling nature, and we have to work with it. And so what we're also seeing in other countries are these really interesting parks. So this park is, let me make sure I get all the information right with this. So this is, it is a stormwater park, or what they also call as a sponge park, and it's 34.2 hectares, and it was a former wetlands. And so they created this into a park that it can be almost completely submerged during flooding, right? And so it funnels the water out and away from the city. So this is also a possibility. This is a park. When it's flooded, you know, they're able to use these walkways, and when it's dry, they can actually get into those green spaces. And I'm also interested in sunken parks, which I don't necessarily have a picture for this presentation. And we have to also think not just about how green infrastructure, green spaces, and parks help humans, but I think we're also at the point of thinking about how do we as humans create situations to help nature within our cities. So I actually fell in love with these umbrellas in Medina, and this is in Saudi Arabia. And these are umbrellas to shade these community members that go to this mosque during pilgrimages. And so could you imagine if we had this in Portland, right? Provide shade, maybe making the ground a little cooler during these heat dome events. But this could also possibly act as a water catchment system that can go into a cistern, or thinking through a drip system in some sort of way, right? We have to start being creative, and we can't just think about what nature can do for us, but also what can we do? What can the built environment do to support nature, right? The Garden by the Bay in Singapore. And so these kind of wild looking tree features, they allow for plants to grow on it. So it's growing vegetation. They act as water catchment and dispersal and misting these plants. Then there are also solar panels. So there's approximately, what did it say, 18 super trees with solar panels that provide all sorts of things, from air venting and collecting rainwater. And it's kind of a funky sort of Jurassic look, which I kind of like as a kid. I'm sure there's all sorts of, you know, back in the day, ancient times that you can play in this location. But again, this is a way of integrating ecology into the city, but also providing some really interesting technologies that doesn't take away, but gives opportunities for nature to grow. And thinking about climate change and severe weather events, microgrids. So this is a tree that the leaves are turbines that blow in the wind and provide electricity. When we're thinking about climate change and severe weather events, we also have to think about shoring up our electrical grids. And wouldn't this be nice around recreation centers that can provide that, not only cooling centers, but clean air centers, especially when we're dealing with wildfires and poor air quality? These microgrids can be so beneficial, especially thinking through the heat dome, where, you know, we're kind of a little worried about the electric grid being able to hold during that time. So what can the city do to provide? And this is Miyawaki urban forest, or what they call a mini forest. And Dr. Miyawaki's method for growing forests is quite phenomenal. Apparently, it grows 10 times faster, 20 times more biodiversity, and it's 30 times denser. And so basically throwing seeds out and seeing where they grow and seeing how they grow over time and allowing it to take up space. And so this is in Pakistan. And as you can see on the left, hardly any vegetation. And then on the right, you see a new, what they call mini or small forests. So this is also a potential for bringing the forest into the urban centers and versus just on the periphery. Right. And so going back to where we started, and when I was talking to Vivek about it, I feel like this is like really two good bookends. So we have the ecosystem services in which Olmsted allowed us through all of his parks to continue creating. But the other thing that Olmsted is known for is building nature, right? His parks were considered to be building nature, but we also have to build with nature and not against nature. So when we're thinking through the possibilities and these new configurations of what could be really exciting and what can be really beautiful, that reciprocity, right? What can we do for the city? What can nature do for the city? And then also what can we and the city do for nature? That is something that we have to constantly be wrestling with when we think about the future, especially if we want to create a environmentally and socially just one. So I can leave it there. And if we want to go ahead, I'm going to stop sharing and then maybe transition to some questions and maybe some thoughts from Vivek.
Sure. Maybe just really quick, Corbin, thanks for pulling us around. And just as we finish top of the hour here, want to just reiterate a couple of themes, and I think we could just open it up and kind of dig in. So we're really talking about this kind of process where we've gone from externalizing nature and thinking about it as novelty in urban areas to really thinking about it as a regularity and thinking about it as dispersed and only in as places of privilege to places of inclusion, places that really are able to bring more density of green spaces into urban environments, this notion of integration, and to really move away from things that are that nature is outside of us to things that it's directly a part of us and an extension of us. And I think as Corbin and I were talking about this, I was really kind of deeply appreciative of our kind of consistency of thinking about intergenerational spaces that are multicultural, that allow for us to think about it emblematic of the past and really preparing and situating the future. And we really, it was really come to a set of themes that I think are at face value might be pretty banal or kind of able to easily talk about, yet are profoundly difficult to find really innovative and bold approaches that communities are taking right now to be socially just and climate ready and really engaging local communities in the design of parks. And so this is, again, a fireside chat and trying to think about it as a set of provocative ideas to see what is plausible and what might be far-fetched for the region, and where can we really enter this conversation in a productive way.
Right. And I like this. I like to think about this and like, what if the city was a park? What would that look like? How would we move through it? What would maintenance look like? Right. And what are the possibilities of those spaces? And I think it's also really not only wrestling with the history of it. I think what we have to do is not be what's a good word for it? Realistic. I don't think this is time to be realistic. I think this is the time to be a little bit more creative and a little bit more, getting out of our traditions as far as green space and park use and trying different things. Again, playing with ideas, playing with opportunities, and realizing, and I didn't get to say this in the presentation, but parks in particular offer one of the few opportunities within cities for people to meet their neighbors and build community in a way that you can't really do in other places. Like, right, if you go to a library and you just sit next to somebody and you start talking to them, you're going to get shushed out, right? Something that you can do in parks, right? Kids playing around, a kid like, what are you reading? These sort of interactions that are spontaneous. This is how community is built and community is made. And so thinking about it in, like, I like to call it a trifecta. How do we think about flora, fauna, and folks? right? Where we're not bringing one more important than the other, but how do we move forward in the future together with the understanding that all of us can work it out and we can all move forward to, again, an environmentally and socially just future.
Thanks, you two. What a provocative presentation. And it's so great to see just the interplay between the two of you. So, not surprisingly, Mike Hauk has the first question, our famed urban naturalist. And I'm going to put a little different spin on it. He complimented you two on the work that you've been doing and the topics you've been taking on. And he wondered if either of you also considers the intrinsic inherent value of nature. Do we have a moral obligation to protect nature for its inherent value? And that brings up a whole host of stuff. So I'm going to let you two kind of freewheel it a little bit, and then I have my thoughts about it. But I want to get to yours first, obviously.
You want to take that first, Vivek?
Yeah, Mike, thanks for the question. It's something that's so deep in me. It's kind of sometimes hard to articulate. Just growing up, absolutely confused, baffled, and so inspired by the forests and the parks around me, and the intrinsic value of nature. I think in many ways, at least the culture from which my family's from, I can maybe start entering it at that point. And having grown up 8 degrees above the equator, many of the traditions, many of the kind of cultural norms, and even to a certain extent institutional norms, were really a big directly linked to traditional practices, indigenous practices that were deeply connected to nature. And so while it may seem like a cultural dimension that folks in other parts of the world are doing, many of the deities that are worshipped are directly linked to a spiritual dimension of nature that I grew up with, that I still hold pretty close to my own kind of ability to recharge and recover from often what's a pretty stressful life. And so the intrinsic value and the moral obligation we have, I think, is something that is, for me, a very evident, a very straightforward, and very deeply resonant idea. To be able to bring that into a public policy realm, I think it offers many different challenges, that many of which I think we've already touched on. And so thinking about what are the mechanisms, what are the means to be able to hold nature in its place, like many of the biologically diverse reserves around the country are attempting to do, is one mechanism that might be a way of doing that. Though there are probably several other that would need to be deepened in terms of an urban application, like conservation easements and what have you, that have attempted to kind of operationalize these intrinsic values in some form. That's at least what I got off the cuff.
Well, it's really hard because I'm going to probably sound like, but what is nature, right? That becomes the question for me, is how are you categorizing it or seeing it? And if you think about nature as everywhere and things that are living, and it becomes a question like, do you value life? Do you value this type of life for flora and fauna, and what does that mean? And so whenever I hear like the intrinsic nature, I wrestle with it, because I think within the United States, and there's a lot of work on this, that we have to recognize that there's a particular culture, nature culture within the United States that might not be the same in other places. And so this idea of our moral obligations to nature, I almost feel like do we have a moral obligation to keeping the air clean? Do we have the moral obligation to, like, how much of this really has to do with the understanding that we benefit from it and that's why it's important, and we might benefit it from different ways. Like E.O. Wilson's, you get your biophilia on when you're in nature. And so you enjoy it in that particular way. Or, nature could be, brutish and harsh, and you may not develop the same love for it, right? So I find it to be a tricky, slippery question, that I feel like you can go all the way back to all of the philosophers and like, what is nature? What is our obligation to it? How much of it is grounded in Christian theology? And because we were banished out of the Garden of Eden, then we have to toil the soil, So, I mean, I don't have an answer for you, but I think there's many answers out there, and it just really depends on how you look at it and what that means for the individual.
I was really taken with the term holistic decentralization in lots of different ways. It's when I first came to Portland 30 years ago, a lot of the conversation was around urban growth boundary and densifying the city. For years, for 2 decades, that was the conversation. You hardly hear anybody talking about it now. And what we see in the loss of trees in East Portland is the development of East Portland. So we have this kind of a bit of an internal conflict going on between a kind of reigning, metaphor for urban development that has been kind of handed down through the generations, and now the actual outcome of that, which is, the development of a lot of land that was previously, had more trees on it. With the city study and your work, Vivek, how do you see those two meeting? And is it in any way an argument for either of you that we should maybe rethink that metaphor of the urban growth boundary and think about more decentralization in order to achieve more green space in and amongst the development we're inevitably going to have to do?
I'll just take a first try at that based on some empirical work we've been doing. It really is, having traveled in different parts of the world, I've come to, at least in my own lived experience, recognize and value that a lot of the way in which humans have decided to settle the land really is a function of kind of the values and the kind of systems that have been developed. So at a very generic level, and the values that I've seen in some parts of the world have allowed for large swaths of green space to find their ways in connected corridors right into the center of the city. And as the examples that Corbin was referring to earlier, I think much of what we're really in the midst of is this kind of, in my sense, this false dichotomy of saying density in a city or greening in a city. And I don't really feel like that's a healthy or productive conversation for us to be having, when really so much of what we've seen and know about the way we design our buildings is about kind of the codes that are in place and the values that we have that the codes are based on. So when I look at a place, for example, in parts of Southeast Asia that I've traveled and kind of really recognize that these amazing green spaces, like massive old banyan trees that I've seen, for example, in South Asia, that are right in the center and actually blocked and bring communities around like they have for millennia together. And to me, I've seen enough of the way in which the values have been applied to code in such a way that it's just largely an elimination of green space, and we're choosing to densify in a specific way, for example, in terms of the built environment, that doesn't really consider trees, green space within that context. And so I really think it's this false dichotomy that we need to get away from thinking about, and really thinking about a more imaginative, some of the examples, for example, that we're talking about today. That's a start. Corbin, anything on that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a false dichotomy, but I think the other part is when you think about managing a city, I think that's where a lot of those opportunities to be creative fall apart, right? We go with what's easy and convenient versus what could be spectacular and beneficial because we're afraid to spend the money or make those big moves, right? And so going back to this idea around holistic decentralization, we'll look at a park. Well, it's just an acre. It doesn't matter. It's not doing what Yosemite does, right? Or you'll go to a urban community garden, like, well, it's not producing this much pounds of food, then it's not going to measure up to conventional farming. Why are we looking at these spaces as useful and needed within the urban realm? And collectively, they might be, how many acres, how many square miles collectively, but dispersed throughout the city, right? And so how do we think through that and create those spaces? How do we think through bioswells, especially the large one that we saw at the beginning, and making sure that there's a couple trees there, that these trees are connected by their roots, because apparently they talk to each other through fungi and all these other things. How are we not implementing that within the city because we decided to put a tree every so distance away from each other and cement them? Maybe they're lonely, maybe they're not flourishing like they can because they are not in the environment that's best for them, right? So it's not just about creating green spaces, but making the green spaces that we create really count, and that they're really beyond museum quality. We get to see this and move forward, but it's integrated. It's part of a larger ecosystem, right? It's connected. It's not just this 1 acre park. This park might be a stepping stone for flora and for fauna in a particular way that gets them from the center of the city to the outskirts. What I'm hoping that we're not creating through the urban boundary is this idea that to get to nature, you have to leave the city. You have to go outside of it to get to it, versus really, allowing it to flourish where we are. And that's something that I don't think we have done well.
Sorry, I have to catch up with the questions. I realized I had this scrolled. Well, while I stall, I'm going to ask another question. So if either of you could be the park czar, and your only limitation is that you have to work within publicly owned land, because we still have this problem of, this Jefferson thing that happened way back where we gridded everything and it's owned. But what we have the streets, and we have land that's owned by parks, and we have some fees that are collected from development that can be used for parks, and maybe other potential taxation measures. But let's work with what we've got. We've got fees from development, and we've got public space of sidewalks and streets and publicly owned space. How would you do things differently? Would you still invest in parks in the way that they have traditionally been done, or in, let's say, how they've been done in the last decade? Or would you think about it differently?
Off of the top of my head, I would say that, thinking through park creation shouldn't be separated from technology fixes, right? So the umbrellas that was presented earlier, they could be water catchment systems, but they can also shade trees, right? So how can we leverage technology to protect cities? So maybe the the traffic mediums need to be wider, and that could be a linear park, right? We can create these spaces all over the city in some really interesting ways. But I don't think a park czar would probably be the best answer, as much as getting community members together and really doing the visioning work. Like, what happens if money didn't count? What do you actually want to do in this space? What would be your dream, right? What would be your dream to have here? And have communities communicate that, and then implement what's possible. Like, don't worry about what your neighbor has. Don't worry about what the next town over has. If you had control over this space, what would you do with it? and then try to figure out a way of making it beautiful and functional, right? And functional in different ways, right? Climate change mitigation, culturally functional for that community, you know, providing spaces for congregation, for community members. Like, how do you get it all in? So that's what I would do, is really first start going to community members, like, what would you really want to use this space for? Or where are their locations where you want to go that you're scared of? Like, how do we change some things around, right? How do we get rid of some of the trauma in some areas by making it beautiful and having maybe a ceremony behind it? I think there's a lot of opportunities to think through what's possible. But I will say this: if I was the I guess green space czar within cities, I think I would require each building to have at least one living wall, just one living wall on one side, and for it to be maintained. And those are silver parks right there, but they're not congregational areas. But they are green spaces, and they provide, you know, biophilia and biodiversity within the city.
I just maybe quickly add to that, Corbin. I 100% like visioning, like, let's go out to 2080, let's scenario that, and let's work back to what it is that we would like communities to really want to have in the region. 100%. I just quick anecdote on the side that might be relevant is, you know, I serve on the Metro's bond oversight committee, and I've been kind of maybe a squeaky wheel on that committee, because I'm constantly pushing for this question of this $500 million that can go, that's essentially voters, very visionary voters approved in 2019, which, you know, we've had decades past. One of the things I'm trying to gauge is the three themes that this bond measure was passed on was racial justice, climate resiliency, and community engagement. And I'm really trying to hold that as, you know, close to my contribution as I can. And as I'm asking questions of why is this massive amount of land bought, you know, far outside the urban growth boundary, and just trying to wrap my mind around it. And while there's so much disinvestment that's happened within urban environments, where can those resources be more effectively used to address historic racial inequities that have been deeply entrenched? I found it really challenging to be able to have that conversation, just frankly. And I'm not it's not a critique against Metro, it's not a critique against, you know, the organizers by any means, though the ability to move a system to really take what they have already identified as critical themes and operationalize that has been, in my experience so far, remarkably challenging. And so I am going to keep on that as a means for being able to think about what would Metro's investment into a green wall for every building look like, or what would it mean for us to be able to create a policy that says no net increase in neighborhood temperatures going forward, and the role that green spaces play in being able to do that. So just to really think about how our systems and the structures that we have are precluding our ability to really pursue some of the provocative slides and imagery and suggestions that we've been bringing up. So a lot to be done still within the systems.
Right, and I would like to dovetail off of that, because and we've had this conversation. We have a new housing situation happening, right, where we might be losing a lot of private green space, right? So what does that mean? Where does that green space, that private green space, how do we make sure that that doesn't go away within the city, right? Because that the you know, one house on 1 acre of land becoming 4 to 6 houses on that acre of land doesn't really leave that acre of land anymore, right? That means that we're going to be open to urban heat island effects in some new ways, and possibly flooding in some new ways. And so the question for me becomes, how does the city recapture that potential loss of green space there and bring it into the public realm? And so, yeah, I think we just need to create more green spaces, but also make those spaces matter to community members. Recreation centers, right? We need cooling, centers. We need clean air centers, especially dealing with the effects of climate change. Who's to say that those rec centers can't have living walls or be built in a way that you can actually play up on top of it, like a hillside, in a sort of maybe Lord of the Rings Frodo sort of way. Those are possible, but why aren't we getting more whimsical with what we're doing? Why aren't we getting creative? Why aren't we getting playful with these spaces, right? We tell people to go out and recreate. It's like you're supposed to go out and recreate with like a straight face, but where's the play, right? Not just for children, but the multi-generational play. And I think we can work in not only green spaces, but those opportunities for multi-generational play throughout the city. And unfortunately, I haven't really seen that creativity really happen yet.
So a question, age-old question, but I'm curious if either of you have fresh opinions about it, is the seeming bind of gentrification and parks and urban, tree canopy. As the trees grow, the value of the neighborhood and the parks grow, the value of the neighborhoods go up. Have you seen examples that have broken that that bind?
I have not seen examples, but I am also from the work that I have done, and I position myself with Neil Smith as gentrification as a city planning tool. And so when we talk about the green spaces producing gentrification versus it being a city decision to put those green spaces, knowing that it's going to increase property values without putting in the necessary legislation and policy to protect rents, then you're going to always get gentrification, right? Because your new park or new green space, new beautification, that means money is being invested in that area. And that tips off other people, other speculators that are going to start raising rents and start raising property values. That is going to ultimately do that. So to think about greening without a housing policy in tandem, you're going to constantly get gentrification. You're going to constantly getting the displacement. And I think the reason for going for holistic decentralization and why that becomes important is that we also realize the compartmentalization of the municipalities that we all live all over the United States, and actually prevents a lot of these sort of holistic solutions to bring in, public works and transportation and parks and rec and the permitting people and law enforcement, all these folks to bear on this space and rethink it for residential uses in particular ways. It's just that compartmentalization, I think, is one of the main reasons why we don't see the creativity and the possibilities of where greening can actually go within cities. So I also suggest a Department of Environmental Justice that handles specifically environmental justice issues. Again, two sides, not only the hazards, right, but also how do we make sure that those communities get access to those healthy green spaces as well.
Vivek, anything to add?
It's interesting, just looking at the change in canopy in Portland, going back to that, we're not necessarily seeing that play out here quite as much as other like tools that are being used by planners, and where we're seeing the greatest canopy gain are places that have always had canopy and always had wealth, and that's something that is empirically measurable in the region. And the places where we're seeing the greatest canopy loss are the places where we're seeing the most amount of communities that have less coping capacity to heat waves and excessive flooding. And so it really is a phenomenon that I'm still kind of waiting to see a lot of. I'm waiting to see the evidence here in Portland, as we have seen, for example, the High Line or other parts of the country, where it's been a very clear relationship between a massive investment of green space like the High Line and kind of the distributional effects of that, and gentrification being one of them.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see, in 5 to 10 years, what property values are around Lewitt View Park or Cully, and see how that, that combination has changed. Vivek, this is a safe space. So even as chair of the Urban Forestry Commission, hopefully we just kind of freewheel it here a little bit. So any developer will, that you ask will tell you that the tree code is draconian, and there's a lot of pushback against it. You have to plant a lot of trees, or you have to plant a lot of trees, with a development. You have to plant a lot to replace trees that are being cut down, maybe in other parts of the city. And so one thing that we haven't seen in this period of massive development is really any kind of measure of how many new trees have been planted, and so what the tree canopy might look like in 10 years. And so I'm wondering if there's any way to determine that data, or how to get that data point to see if the tree code is actually working. And then the second part of my question is, how would you want to change the tree code in order to create better outcomes that you are hoping for?
Oh boy, how much time do we have left? This is good.
I know you could probably nerd out on this for a long time, but
yeah, I think you've posed the kahuna, the big question here right at the end as we're wrapping up. The things that I am so amazed by is the fact that we have a tree code, that we're actually systematically creating a means of conversation with this code. And somebody trained in planning, I can really value the fact that we have something that is a direct byproduct of conversations with communities, with municipal managers, and that we can point to. We can quibble about where to revise the tree code. In fact, City Council will be hearing a set of revisions that Urban Forestry has put forward. And things that Bureau of Planning Sustainability have looked at, and the Planning Bureau Commission, as well as the Urban Forestry Commission have looked at these revisions. The depths of which the tree code needs to change, in my reading, are bigger than this initial set of revisions, which to me are reasonable, but not really a deep dive into the tree code. It's been 6-7 years since the tree code has been promulgated, and there are things in it like, when we're looking at the percentage of canopy cover in the city, which says 33%, where 33% came from, I don't know. It's a rough number, and we have much better ways of being able to characterize. I mean, if we're strictly thinking even ecosystem service-wise, we have ways to be able to provide much more defensible approaches, not only from a kind of a methodological and kind of scientific realm, but also from a community perspective. Like, what are the things that some communities are moving towards? And I really think we can be a bit more systematic about it. I think we can be a bit more ambitious about it, frankly. And I think we really need to deal with this issue of tree maintenance, because we're going to plant trees in a bunch of neighborhoods, and then we're saying essentially, as a community or as a city, good luck taking care of that tree. And so there's some fundamental, like, structural issues that I think the tree code is not addressing, that and is relatively modest about at this point, that we can really retool just to begin that conversation.
So, Paul, that was actually another question. Do we need to prune the trees in order to create a healthy tree canopy, or can we, leave it up to private property owners as it currently is?
Yeah, there you have it. I mean,
is that an essential element, do you think, to this, or is it, a nice to have?
I don't know. Do you like to cut your nails, and do you like to, get a hair did every so often? Like it's like we got all of this beautiful verdant forest in this city still. Many places that can't do what we can do just because of climatological reasons, and here we are just not really even thinking about and and putting a budget into tree maintenance in the city. And to me, that's just a really bizarre kind of reality that we're living in right now. And while we are struggling to fill all the potholes in the city and city streets, and that's a big conversation going on, it's like tree maintenance is something that we're trying to lift up over and over because there's systematic inequities that are based. And after an ice storm comes through or a heat wave comes through and you see limbs falling on cars and other places, and it just raises the question of if we can do this preventative medicine and really find ways to better maintain our tree canopy, we'll see far less damage and infrastructure impacts in the future. Just, yeah.
See, we need to wind this down. It's 7:38. So I'm going to, once again, steal an idea from Ezra Klein and invite you to suggest a couple of books that we could read for inspiration. And that really could help highlight some of the issues that we've discussed tonight.
I'll go with the sci-fi Ecotopia.
That was like a Bible when I first moved here. You had to read that. That was sort of like part of your Northwest Catechism.
Yeah, so I would say Ecotopia, and then like Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower could be a good one. Acorn is a really inspirational sort of town that happens there. But I think sci-fi in general can give you some really great ideas of what's possible. Like if you can take the visual representation of nature in the city and disband the social tensions that make the movie really interesting, that'd probably be, one way of going about it.
Yeah, I can't say anything more than what Corbin just said. I mean, there's some more scientifically oriented things that, at least in the kind of vein of some of the stuff I was presenting today, I would really go just to the fundamentals of some of the system level change conversation. And something I tell grad students that I think they have to read in my courses is beginning with The Structure of Scientific Revolution. And that is just something that I find to be an important idea of paradigm shift and thinking about different ways to be able to kind of move and change systems. That's something I feel like leaving a grad program, every student has to have a good grasp of. So I'll kind of echo that. And of course, heroes of mine like Vandana Shiva, for example, somebody I spent a lot of time having read in the past. And there's a great deal of tree story, like the overstory and these lots of tree books coming out right now, The Hidden Life of Trees. I mean, there's so many really interesting kind of green space inspiring, The Soil Will Save Us kind of books that I find myself really attracted to these days.
Awesome. Well, I was listening to an interview with Margaret Atwood a couple of days ago, and she stressed the need, if we're going to really tackle climate change in any meaningful way, we have to make it fun, because people won't do it if it isn't fun. And so thanks for providing some inspiration for thinking about this in a much more fun framework, even as you all pointed out some very, very serious realities that we need to confront. So thanks so much. Your obvious preparation for this was just awesome, and really appreciate you being here. Thanks to US Bank for sponsoring this series, and we'll see everybody next time.